Okay, so this is going to be the plaited basket weave, and this is one of my favorite stitches because it's so pretty. And you really get that sense of braiding happening in it, or truly a basket weave. One of the first things you're going to notice is you're on a bigger needle than usual. I think you're up 1 or 2 sizes from the rest of the bag, and that's because these stitches need to be elongated to make the braiding that you're going to see. So for what we're doing, we're going to work on an uneven number, and the first stitch of each row is going to be worked individually. This is the knit side, as you can see the knit stitches, then there's a purl side. So I'm just going to work that first stitch just as a normal knit stitch. Then, to work the basket weave, we're going to work this second stitch before we work the first stitch. And it's a little bit challenging to do this. So what you're going to do is you're going to come in from behind the first stitch, so literally just pull up into it, capture that first leg of the second stitch, and come through off to the side. And then you're going to go into the first stitch on the needle. And at that point, you'll drop it off. So let me show you that again. Behind the first stitch, into the second stitch, come out, oops, I'm trying to do this slowly, come into the second stitch, come out the side. That stitch is going to be on the needle. Separate the two, go into the first stitch, and now, really important, make sure you drop both of them off. Let me show it to you one more time in this style, and then I'll switch to throwing. It does help if you come down onto the tips a little bit. Behind the first stitch, into the second stitch, off to the side, into that first stitch, all the way through, and drop both of them off. Okay. When I'm talking about coming behind the first stitch, you're literally just coming right behind it. Going into the front leg of the second stitch, coming through that leg, but you're just pulling your yarn off to the side like that. Separating the two a little bit, coming in and around that first stitch and all the way off. Again, behind the first, into the second, wrap around, come under that first one, come under that second stitch, and then go into the first stitch, wrap, and all the way off. Now, there are actually 2 ways of doing this stitch. The other way is to go into the back loop, but when you go into the back loop of the second stitch, it twists the stitch, and I don't like it as much. So we're doing it this way. It's a little bit more tedious, but at the very, very end, with our very last stitch, we're going to do it that way, so you'll kind of see how it works. Into the first, and drop both of them off. Now we're at the very end, the very last stitch. So in the last stitch, we're going to go into the back loop of the second stitch, right? 1 and 2. So we're going to go into the back loop, knit that back loop, come around, and knit the front loop. We're doing that in the back loop on the last stitch only because it kind of tightens it up a little bit on that edge and it looks a little bit better. For the wrong side, this is one of those few times that you'll be like, oh my God, I love the purl side. The very first stitch, we're just going to purl. And now we're back working in our pairs again. So I'm going to come into the second stitch first. And because we're already on this side, it's easier to see it. So I'm just going to pop into that second stitch, pop into that first stitch, and now take them both off. Now, while it's easier to pull your stitches down toward the tip to get into them, be sure when you're making these stitches that you're making them on the full size of the needle. Because if you make them just on the tips, you're going to end up with these tiny tight stitches that you're not going to be able to get into on the second row. So go all the way through. Into that second stitch, purl it, don't take it off the needle, into the first stitch, purl it, and off. Let me switch ways of purling. Purling's a little hard for me in this style, so let's give it a try. In and around, and then into the first stitch. Okay, insert into the second stitch, and through, into the first stitch, and around. Okay, into the second stitch. And this one on this side, the stitch is exactly the same all the way to the end. Second stitch, first stitch, drop them both off, second stitch, and first stitch. And all the way off. Okay, you can see that really pretty basket weave that it's making. I'm going to work to the end over here one more time and show you that last stitch in just a second. Okay, so we're at that last stitch of the front needle, and this is the only one that's worked differently. We're going to come into that back loop, knit the back loop on the second stitch, and the front loop of the first stitch, and off. And that again just tightens up that little edge a little bit. It's going to make it easier for seaming later. Okay, so I'm going to just show you one more thing, and that is how to bind this off, because you're basically going to be binding off in pattern. So that means you're going to be binding off kind of partway through these stitches. So remember, we knit our first one, we grab, go into that second stitch. Now at this point, even though I haven't taken that stitch off the needle yet, I need to go ahead and bind off. Now I'm going to go into the first stitch of those two, take both of them off, and bind that stitch off. Okay, I have a stitch here, right? So I'm going to pop in here, go into that second stitch, come all the way through, that stitch goes up on my needle, I bind that stitch off, go into the first of that pair, knit it, take the other stitch off, and bind that off. Okay, let me try that the other way for you just real quick. Okay, I'm going to go into, as always, right, this is my little pair, I'm going to go into the second stitch, I'm going to knit that second stitch, but I'm going to take a moment now and I'm going to bind that off. Then I'm going to go into the first stitch of the pair, taking both of them off the needle at that point and binding that one off. Show it to you again. Come into that second stitch, knit it, leave it on, but bind this one off. Go into the first stitch. Got twisted, there we go. Come around it, take both of them off at that point, bind that stitch off. I'll just do one more, then I think you guys got it. Into the stitch, knit that second stitch. Sorry. There we go, into the stitch. And knit that second stitch, but not take it off the needle. Bind off that stitch. Go into the first of those two stitches, knit it, and bind it off. And since I am ever so much better a continental knitter, I'll just do it one more time that way just to reinforce. Into that second stitch, come all the way around, bind it off, come into that first stitch, now take them both off and bind it off. So that's giving you a bind off that's still in the pattern. So you can see the pattern of those stitches right there. Okay, so that's your plaited basket weave. Thanks.